Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a really important conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about the 55th anniversary of the incident at Kent State on May 4th, 1970. But most importantly, we're going to have a very important conversation about today and how student advocates are still on the front lines of a lot of our nation's most critical policy fights and conversations. So before we jump in today, I'd love to have everyone who's on with us introduce themselves. I am Jen Ellis, Director of State Government Relations at All4Ed, before I forget to introduce myself. But if we could go ahead and go around and just say who is joining me today before we get started.
I can start. I'm Rebecca Shackelford. I'm Jen's counterpart on the federal side, so the Director of Federal Government Relations.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Adam File. I am the Director of Professional Learning and Leadership at All4Ed, and I'm happy to be here today to have this conversation.
Hi, buenos dias. Oh, sorry, Luis. All right. Amy Lloyd, I am the CEO of All4Ed. Glad to have you all here.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. Luis Mata, Government Relations Manager with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition.
And thank you all for joining us. We're going to have a very robust panel conversation. Before we jump into that, I just want to provide a little bit of context about May 4th. Like I said, today, unfortunately, we don't have time to give it the full treatment that it deserves, which would be many, many hours of conversation. But I do want to point people, Kent State has a really incredible website, a memorial site, but also a site that has captured all of the nuance, all of the historical documentation. And so I encourage people, if they're interested, and I hope you are interested, to go there to hear the whole story. For the context of our conversation today, when we talk about May 4th, 1970, I think it's important to talk about what was happening in our country in 1970, which was that we had been embroiled in the Vietnam War for a long period of time. We have a lot of college campus demonstrations and protests around that as people are seeing their peers drafted into the military in that conflict. In 1970, Richard Nixon was nominated in 1968. He becomes the president, largely around a promise to get us out of the Vietnam War. 1970, we still are not out of the Vietnam War, but protest activity is decreasing. That changes on April 30th, 1970, which is 4 days before May 4th, when Richard Nixon goes on television and announces that the United States of America has invaded Cambodia. That sets off a national outrage. A lot of campuses see protest activity pretty immediately. Kent State is not alone in this, but they are one of the campuses that sees protest activity starting on Friday, May 1st. That protest activity, which goes through the weekend, sees many students and protesters in conflict with police officers. There is a general air of chaos. In the midst of that, the mayor contacts the governor of Ohio and asks that the National Guard be deployed to Kent State University. Estimates are about 1,000 to 1,200 National Guardsmen descend on the campus and occupy it. On May 3rd, that's Sunday at this point, the governor of Ohio himself, Governor Rhodes, actually comes to Kent State and issues a very inflammatory statement where he calls these protesters the worst of what America has to offer. He also makes the implication, and he is not alone in making this is in the media at the time as well, that these campus protests on Kent State and in other universities are not being run by students, but are essentially being infiltrated by radical groups that are going campus to campus in an attempt to destroy higher education in America and some of these small towns. I want to just take a pause here to note that in the hindsight of history, this has been looked at by scholars. These were absolutely students on the campus. Those claims are absolutely untrue. Students were unarmed. So on May 4th, in the morning, students gather in the Commons in Kent State. Like I said, unarmed, peaceful protesters exercising their First Amendment rights. The National Guard attempts to disband that group of students. They refuse to leave. The National Guard starts deploying things like tear gas. Students start fleeing into a very chaotic environment. At some point, what is known in that chaos, about 28 National Guard members turn and open live fire on the student body. That lasts for about 13 seconds. I believe they fire between 61 to 67 live rounds of ammunition. It results in the death of 4 students, the injury of 9 additional students, including one of those injured students is permanently paralyzed. The 4 students who are killed that day are Jeffrey Glenn Miller, Allison Beth Krause, William Knox Schroeder, and Sandra Lee Scheuer. About 11 days later, and I think this is also very important, in Mississippi on the campus of Jackson State, we have another incident involving police and law enforcement opening live fire on a student body. On the campus of Jackson State, there are students outside of a women's dormitory. Now, again, on the campus of Jackson State around this time, there is protest activity, both in relation to the Vietnam War, but also related to a number of civil rights violations happening in the state of Mississippi and on the campus of Jackson State. There is a lot of chaos and uncertainty, but what's clear is there are unarmed students standing outside this dormitory, many of whom are not involved in the protest activity going on. This is local and state law enforcement at this time, not the National Guard. They open fire on those students for about 30 seconds. They fire 460 shots at a distance of 30 to 50 feet from those students. They injure 12 and they kill 2 young men, Philip Lafayette Gibbs, who is 21, he's a junior at the time, and James Earl Green, a 17-year-old high school senior from a local high school. Those 2 events are the inciting events that lead to the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, which ultimately finds that the use of force in these 2 incidents is not justified under any circumstances. Like I said, there's a lot more nuance to capture, but I want to get into our panel conversation today. Because unfortunately, we're seeing some of the same rhetorical things that led up to these incidents in some of our own news and media. So the first thing I'd love to ask each of you is, on the question of that rhetoric, before May 4th and before, obviously, 11 days later, May 15th, the Jackson State incident, there was a lot of dangerous rhetoric about student protests on campus and also around towns. This included language that these groups had been infiltrated by radical revolutionaries, that some of these protesters were the worst of America, even though they were just out exercising their First Amendment rights. Unfortunately, we're seeing some of this rhetoric now in relation to campus protests, but also in relation to people showing up at town halls and other gatherings. I just wonder, do you all see the parallels in your work? And what are some of the risks of kind of where we were rhetorically leading up to what actually happened?
Yeah, Jen, I definitely see the parallels in what we're hearing today. I live in Washington, D.C. I was here on January 6th, and I know what I saw, and I also know what I hear happened, and they're not necessarily the same thing. I think something that's really important to know about these events that happened 55 years ago is that at the time, what people were saying, and even honestly, some people in those communities today still believe these things. They're being told a lie. And the reason that we know the truth is because we have media. We have these images that help us see what really happened. And I think that's why it's so important for us in these moments to really continue to document them. Even if the rest of the world doesn't want to tell the truth, like we have a lot of power in our own way, like on our phones, like we have these computers in our hands that allow us to tell the truth, even if the rest of the media is not doing that with us.
Yeah, if I can hop in there, one thing that, just when you see this story, you realize that history has a tendency to repeat itself. We see how American citizens were demonized, almost made to be believed as others, because it's easier to attack. It's easier to vilify when they're seen as though these people are othered. And almost we have this tendency to weaponize what it means to be a patriot, weaponize what it means to be an American. And if I can make this other group seem less than American, less than a citizen, less than a person, then it's justified to have that action. It's justified to damage, to hurt, if this person is not considered to be as an equal to you. And when you look at the press, when you look at what the politicians were pushing the narrative at that time, that's what it was. These people, these students, these children, let's just call it what it is. These children were called bums. They were called, anti-American. These were, so when you can get rid of something that's less than, I don't have to feel bad about it. So that's literally the narrative that was going on during this time period for people expressing their constitutional right for having a voice. So we like to think of ourselves as a country as we are above this fray. but it doesn't take much, as we see from this, to make us just like these other countries that, for example, our country, I think we're better than. So we really have to look in the mirror when we have these types of incidents to ensure that they don't happen again.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here. I think that this reminds me of, the saying of intentionally sinking the ship to sell us the life rafts, right? I think that it's this coordinated effort to silence dissent that we see here, and I'm talking specifically about here in Tennessee as well, but I think something that comes up a lot is this coordinated effort to try to paint a picture of a group, a marginalized group, and then point it as the bad guys, right? And I think that whenever we talk about universities and colleges of this rhetoric of these being hubs of liberal institutions, right, and brainwashing students and kids, and I think that this is the long-term effort that we're seeing here against folks who are amplifying their voices, who are coming to ages of being able to amplify their voices, advocate and organize for their communities. So yeah, I think that that's definitely, as was mentioned, we see history repeating itself. So
as far as like the echoes of history, I guess one of the things that really hits for me constantly is there's this way of how when we remember something in history, it almost gets like washed out a little bit in that the story seems so simple. And then when we're seeing the repeats, it's so complex. And I think that sometimes people have a hard time making those connections because like, so for example, I think when we remember like what happened at Kent State, what happened at Jackson State now, it's like that was an atrocity. And the public saw it and they said, absolutely not. And they rose up against the government and they said, you can't treat our students this way. That's not what happened. In fact, even after the events, there was really incendiary rhetoric and news stories. These students continued to have issues when they returned home. There were people who thought the National Guardsmen were correct. There were people who defended the actions that they took. Now, with hindsight now, there's been like inquests and legal battles, and we know the whole story now, and we know that they were absolutely not justified. But the story isn't so simple as like, bad thing happened, everyone agreed and took care of it. And I think sometimes what the damage of that narrative where we think like a historical event happened, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the Little Rock Nine in one of these broadcasts, when we talk about these events as like contained to their historical moment, sometimes when we are in that moment of history right now, it's like, well, I don't know if this is exactly that because there's people saying they're justified and there's a lot of discourse and it's complicated and it's hard to figure out what the truth is. And it's like, that's how it felt then too. It's just with that hindsight of history that we see what the truth was. And so in the same way, what we're living through right now, we're not going to see that clarity for a long time, but we can't wait to act till we have that clarity. And so I just think it's an important point. What all of you are talking about is like these echoes of history, but also realizing that if you were like in this moment, some of our listeners may have lived through this moment in Kent State, it wouldn't have been cut and dry. The media was not treating it that way. And with some of the things we're seeing today, we would have seen that same complexity in those same debates. So I don't know. I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts on that, but it's something that I think about a lot when we think about how we compare things to history and how we learn from it and bring it into the present moment.
I was really discouraged that the majority of Americans at the time blamed the protesters. Like that is just the public perception of this event in the moment. And even years later at the civil trial for this, there was never an apology issued. There was a statement of regret on behalf of the Ohio National Guard, but never an apology. And I think about what President Nixon said about this event. And he said, when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy. And his Vice President Agnew said that it was a predictable outcome of what was happening. And that's frankly terrifying. I think about everything that was happening in that moment in 1970, and not only the backdrop of the Vietnam War era and the invasion of Cambodia, but of course, civil rights, women's rights, like just this confluence of people standing in their power standing and wanting to create a more just, more equitable, more engaging society for us all. And I think about the hands-off protests that have been happening lately, and I've been interested in and seeing some of the media news around, like, everybody's holding a different sign. They don't even agree on what they're talking about. The challenge is, in these moments, there is often multiple narratives that are all true. Like, people are dissatisfied and want to create a better nation on so many different fronts, and those parallels are definitely very, very present right now. Our nation is very politically divided, very culturally divided, and some even say that we are in a nonviolent civil war currently. And that, frankly, scares me. You know, what does this mean, and what can we learn from events like Kent State, like Jackson State, about what happens when the temperature goes up in these kinds of escalated opportunities for students to voice their opposition. And to be clear, it wasn't all protesters. Schroeder and Scheuer were just walking by campus. They were on their way to class. And James Green in Jackson State was a high school student on his way home from a job. They were caught in live fire, and they were not even engaged in the protests. And so I want us to remember that it harms all of us, regardless of where you stand, when this kind of First Amendment right to free speech turns to active conflict and violence.
And I'd love to jump in on this topic of, how, living in the moment versus, how it's viewed afterwards. I think that this is very timely with what we have been focused on here in recent hours, doing rapid response for a mass coordinated immigration enforcement raid here in Nashville, Tennessee. And a lot of what has been coming out has been this narrative of, well, they're just doing their jobs, right? They're just doing their jobs. And, when have we heard that in history before too, right? They're just doing their jobs. They're enforcing the laws as should be done, right? It takes us back to when we heard the same rhetoric coming from the Nazis, right? And we see that coming up now of, how would you have reacted then in that moment to how would you react right now when we are seeing families being separated, mothers on their way to work, being taken off the streets, right? That's, I think, something that comes up for me right now.
Absolutely. And Louise, if you don't mind, I'd love for you to just give everyone a little bit of context of what's been going on in Tennessee and some of the work you've been doing, particularly with student advocates, but just more generally, because you are really on the front lines of some really big political and policy debates going on right now.
Absolutely. So what we've been saying is, what we see here in Tennessee is felt throughout the country, right? And I view this in two ways, right? One, in the attacks that we see against our communities, but two, the collective organizing effort that has come out of the South, right? And specifically in Tennessee, I'm thinking of and in the context of youth organizing, I'm thinking of, the Nashville student movement in the 60s that led to sit-ins, to desegregation, the Civil Rights Act. And so we see that a lot of times Tennessee has been the tip of the spear, right? And what we have seen recently, right, is, this is super majority that has established itself who, basically drunk on power of trying to silence dissent, trying to criminalize our communities. And we have seen this time and time again. And now with our political climate, we have seen an increase of that, specifically on immigration. And what we've been saying is also that immigration is being used as the driving vehicle to continue to lead us down a road of authoritarianism on the backs of immigrants. And we have seen that here. Our most recent fight was the Education for All Tennessee campaign that was launched by everyday Tennesseans, students, educators, faith leaders, business owners, who came together to send a message loud and clear that education belongs to all of us, right? And this was a message that we sent loud and clear that our lawmakers could not ignore. We were able to make sure that that piece of legislation did not advance this year, given that it was brought forth by the majority leader in an extreme supermajority here in Tennessee. And this has implications that are nationwide, right? It was an attempt to challenge longstanding Supreme Court precedent. The sponsors of the piece of legislation, when they introduced it in their press release, said, "We like our chances to take it up to the Supreme Court." And we fought back, and what we've been saying the whole time is the power of the people is greater than the people in power. And we have taken that, drawing hope, drawing inspiration from the folks who kept that motto in mind throughout history and brought it and saw that reality take place this year.
No, thank you so much. It's like the heroic efforts that you all have been engaged in Tennessee. I think what this brings up for me and a lot of the conversations we've had before is so often, especially in our education system, we are teaching our students from a very young age to be civically engaged, to be confident in having their voices heard, to understand history, to learn from these lessons. And to some extent, I think we largely applaud our students from getting involved, from starting to have their voices heard. And then there comes a time where the public then turns against them because they view them as becoming too disruptive, and I think that's what we see consistently in these historical stories. And we put that burden largely on our students to kind of move these causes forward and put themselves, sometimes their physical body, on the line. And obviously what we see in Kent State, we're talking about college students, but to be clear, still, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. And in the case Jackson State, a 17-year-old boy as well. And so some of the work you've been doing, Louise, too, and I think that we see in other cases, also with the climate change movement, we see students as young as elementary school out as part of these engagements. I just wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that in particular, and kind of the responsibility and burden that we're placing on some of these young people in the context of these very large, we'd say adult problems, but I think, children also obviously have a stake in them. But yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jen, because, here in my town, we do not control our own budget. So in the last few weeks, as, we've seen coming out of the White House and from this administration, an effort to dismantle the Department of Education, it has an impact on every child in America, obviously, but it has an outsized impact on this particular city. And a friend of mine was just sending me pictures of her son, who is a kindergartner, protesting. And it is at once like this beautiful thing that we live in a place where everyone's voice matters. And at the same time, so painful to know that a 5-year-old has to go fight for something that we as adults should have already fixed for him.
Well, and thank goodness for the fire of youth, right? Like, I'm so grateful that, I have a teenage daughter, and Gen Z is like teaching me so much about how to be in the world, about how to have more nuanced perspectives, about how to voice what matters in ways that, my Gen X generation did in its own way. But I'm so grateful that we have Gen Z, Gen Alpha, our young ones coming up to help us move even forward in our journey towards justice, towards liberation, towards equity, towards supporting every single person in our country, regardless of who they are, where they are, and having, a joyful, choice-filled life. And our young people are often the ones who are the most activist oriented. They carry with them that fire of youth. And I am grateful for that, but I also worry about, as we've seen, and I'll, rotate to the higher education space, campus protests on higher education in higher education have become increasingly violent. Like this past year, all the protests against the violence in Gaza and things that have been perceived to be pro-Hamas, but instead are, pro-humanitarian or pro-Palestinian. perceived to be anti-Israel, but instead are like, how can we all get along? Although, who knows? People come to these protests with different perspectives. I will grant that. But I've been dismayed by seeing the shifts in how our young people speaking up on college campuses are now being curtailed. So college campuses are now kind of limiting the timeframes in which students may protest, or requiring that students submit applications to be able to, hold a protest. Or even just a couple of days ago, the state of Arizona at the state legislature level banned encampments on, campuses of higher education, both community colleges and 4 years. Often colleges will prohibit where students can hold protests, or have even limits on certain speech. And so I think about our young people who are coming up in this world are acutely aware of their rights and of wanting to build a more just world, and are seeing the dissonance that our institutions are now reacting to this kind of voice with. And I want to raise my daughter to know how to stand up for herself, to know how to stand up for what matters to her. And I also want her to be safe. Like Rebecca said, I worry about the safety and well-being of anyone who now speaks out. And I think about, to Luisa's point on immigration, we don't even have a clear handle on how many international students have had their visas revoked for indeterminate reasons. Some reports are in the 1,000, 1,600, some are over 4,000 students, but across our nation, people from all over the world come to our country in search of opportunity, in search of incredible learning opportunities. And they are suddenly just being texted or emailed saying, you now must leave. Sometimes in relationship to freedom of speech issues, sometimes in relationship to things like parking ticket violations. And then I think about, well, if it could happen to our international students, what is the next step to harming, our native born students? What about birthright citizenship, which is now in question, which has never been in question before? What about those of us who are American born, but speak out as our patriotic duty to make our nation better? And so I am so hopeful and so determined by our younger people showing us a stronger, better way, as each generation should. And I am so worried about just their well-being and their safety in this moment.
You were talking about students there, and it's so many levels to this. I don't want to be the predictor of doom and gloom, but I see student loans being the next target now. If a student speaks out against something that our current administration doesn't like, how can you control that? Well, I'm going to take away your federal student aid. So if you have any, so to your point, American-born students, that's how we're going to control you. We're going to kick you out of school by taking away your student aid if we deem that you are now an enemy of the state. And which is so wild to me when I hear this, because I think about taking it to the technology lens. I never learned about this in school. I never learned about the Kent State massacre in school. I didn't learn about Jackson State. I learned about those in my adult life. I had the privilege, the honor to attend the Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama, where I got that education from professors who were on the front lines at times. So I got that education. But now TikTok and other platforms is how a lot of these students are learning about this stuff. They're getting a different form of education because you have all these influencers now being able to share these stories that for years, for decades have been kept from us, from the mainstream. So when you see now all these individuals are learning about this, they're becoming more aware, they're taking action. So I love the fact that technology has been now able to educate a whole different generation of activists around these topics, and they give them ideas on how they can collaborate and they can share this knowledge with each other, because we see this can happen. We see the writings on the wall right now. Our current administration is taking pages out of Nixon's playbook, and it's obvious what's happening. And so we have to be aware of it so we can take proper steps to ensure not only that they have a voice, but their safety, because I'm concerned for the safety of our students as we see this militarization of our campus police that's happening, because they have a voice, they should be heard. And just because I disagree with you, you disagree with me, doesn't mean you need to get shot. It doesn't mean you need to get attacked. I always wondered as a child when I'd see those civil rights videos, how did people stand by and let this happen? I was like, oh, well, what was wrong with these people? Because these are quote unquote good people. How did they allow this to happen? And I see that not right now we have an obligation to not stand by and allow this to happen, or our kids, the next generation, will be looking at us saying, what were you doing when that happened? How were you standing by and allowing that to happen? And I don't want to be on the bad side of that conversation. So I
Right.
encourage everyone to take action to what's going on right now.
This is not a me thing, but I've seen a lot of people say this, and I encourage us all to self-reflect on this. If you ever wondered what you would have done in Nazi Germany, if you ever wondered what you would have done during the civil rights movement, what you're doing right now is what you would have done. So if you're not doing anything, I encourage you to go do something. And I think there's always something that you can do. Some of it is just shining a light on these things, talking about this, having this conversation is so important, reminding people that this is not new. Making sure that Adam, the people who were sitting in the classrooms with you and me who didn't hear about this, so encouraging people to learn more about these things that happen in history. All of this is so important, and we just have to keep working.
I think sorry.
I was just going to say, I worry about how we are such a polarized society right now, and that often this work feels like, I feel like Howard Zinn's notion, like you can't be neutral on a moving train, right? Like you inevitably fall on some side of some issue. However, like in our increasingly widening and deepening polarization, I also want us to remember that we are one nation, and like these issues cut across so many dimensions of identity, and cut across families differently even. And I think about like the young people who were the National Guardsmen, frankly, like they were also 19-year-olds. And prior to the horrors of the murders of Americans on Americans, like the National Guardsmen and the students were talking and chatting, and then things escalated thereafter. Like, how are we supporting learning across divides, and how are we listening deeply to understand where people are coming from? Because often, people are coming from a place of hurt or from a place of believing that they're doing the right thing or doing what they're told to do. And how do we create a space for us all to question, like, what lifts us all up? And how do we make sure that we're not inadvertently widening a divide where, we are only going to have even more space to traverse to really come together and grow together as a nation. So I can't be neutral on a moving train, but also like we need to remember that we are all caught in an inescapable web of mutuality, as Dr. King says, and that our well-being is bound up with one another. And that is a hard thing to remember when we are staunchly on sides. And I don't know how to, other than like ensuring greater civics education and creating more spaces like our public schools for students of all walks of life to come together and learn together, how to create more space for us to start to repair this divide that we're living through right now.
I think that's such an important point, Amy. I worry too that when, there's so much nuance. If you believe in America as the promise of this like diverse, nuanced marketplace of ideas, right? There is space for all this diversity of thought. I can agree with you on the broad strokes and disagree on the details. And that's like the beauty of the marketplace of idea, right? We can each have a completely distinct view. And I think where you see this reflected physically is in some of these protest activities. Like you said, like there are people doing things. Before May 4th on the Kent State campus, a group of students burns down the ROTC building, which is one of the big inflammatory acts that like kind of leads to some of the altercations. It's a small group of students though. And so like recognizing the nuance of these moments, how chaotic they are, people are coming to this movement from different reasons. Some of them are just watching, some of them are, like you said, walking to class. And I think if you think of that as like one little microcosm of like the American experience, I think what you see is like historically, when we start to narrow the story, where there are right opinions and wrong opinions, and there are opinions that are so dangerous that some people don't have the right to have them. And that is truly, we have all these debates about what it means to have freedom of speech. but this is truly what it means to have freedom of speech. And we've seen the courts reflect that. Like the idea that also that certain people essentially should be grateful and not have the right to express certain opinions. So what we see with like students who are on certain visas saying like, well, you've been given permission to be here, but you don't have the right to speak certain ideas. That to me is incredibly, incredibly dangerous rhetoric. And I think we see that, you know, when we go back to 1970 with not as much in the context of student visas or immigration, but this idea that like these students who are on these college campuses, who many of whom were able to defer being drafted, should essentially be grateful to their country and should essentially like shut up and get on with their lives. And there was this kind of like inability to humanize them in that moment. And I really, really worry about that. I guess in this moment, I'd love all of you to just kind of opine on this, where I think before we get to these incendiary moments where people actually get hurt, right? It starts with this narrative where like the marketplace of ideas starts to narrow, and we no longer capture the nuance of like, if 100 people are in a sit-in on a campus, they could be there for 100 different reasons. But instead we start to see it conflate into like dangerous people, bad people. And then like pretty soon after that, we hit a point where obviously what we're remembering today in Kent State and Jackson State is violence by the state that leads to the death and injury of a number of students. But also, I think what we're seeing now, the physical arrest, deportation, loss of liberty of students, I would say is also violence. And so I don't know. I guess I think about that, how some of the things we saw a few years ago, as far as like book banning and this conversation about ideas, has essentially led us to this moment where we're actually starting to see now people physically lose their liberty, and how that kind of echoes to me of this moment that we're remembering today.
Yeah, if I can just really quick on that one, I think we have to be mindful of the people who like to throw rocks and hide their hands on these issues. You have people who will inflame a topic. They don't really care about the solution. It's I have the power now. I have a microphone in front of me if somebody wants to listen to me. So let me inflame my audience, and then I'm going to hide when it gets a little too rough. And I'm going to say, well, that's not what I intended to happen, or that I will blame the victim in these circumstances. I mean, we saw this happen in January, on January 6th. I mean, you have to look at the situation, because even looking at the people who decided to do that attack on January 6th, in their heart of hearts, they felt they were wrong somewhere. Some kind of way they felt that they were wronged. And we need to have a conversation to figure out, okay, why do you feel this way? So with these students, the students who burned down the ROTC building, yes, there may have been some bad apples, but why did you feel that was your action that you needed to take? What had transpired to get you to that point? We sometimes want to just throw people away and get rid of the key, but we need to understand what has it caused a person to stop talking and want to resort to violence to resolve whatever issue that they are facing. That means we have a breakdown in our communication. Something has happened. We have wronged that individual to a certain degree where they feel as though that's their only recourse. So we need to tear down those layers and have that conversation and realize we may never agree, but we need to try to understand. I may never agree with you on the topic, but I need to understand and respect where you stand on that topic. And that's really where we have that conversation of we can agree to disagree, where I will never get why you feel that way, but I understand your stance on that. We have to get there. And I think that's that thing that we're missing. And until we have the conversations about these issues, the real conversation, that's when we grow and develop that skill to have in-depth conversations around these very complicated topics.
Adam, you just made me think of James Baldwin's quotation that like we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And you know when things are pushed that far, what happened before that? I really appreciate you calling that into question. Like how are students' voices not being heard such that it led them to determine that they needed to burn down an ROTC building? And Bill Schroeder was an ROTC student himself, by the way. And so like this is it's a complicated, nuanced issue, but we do need to learn how to disagree better and not root that disagreement in oppression and othering. And, as you and Rebecca were saying, at the top of the conversation, like when you can other somebody enough that they no longer have humanity, then it's easy to take these actions. It's easy to, I don't know if you saw, you probably did, the video of the graduate student from Tufts University from Turkey who was detained by ICE agents because she had penned an op-ed in support of Palestine. And then the president just a couple nights ago was on Meet the Press and was saying that he didn't know whether or not everybody was should be afforded due process, which is what, Amendment 5 of the Constitution, like that we are questioning due process for everyone in our country, and that we are othering people to the extent that we put hoods over their heads and we throw them in vans because they wrote something that somebody did not agree with, is really terrifying in this moment.
I also think, and like circling back, particularly, Louise, some of the work you were talking about with students, we ask these students to be at the front of this when often they are the ones that are going to be most directly harmed by these policies. So, for example, in immigration, we ask our students who potentially are not documented or have family members who are not documented to expose themselves to be part of this movement for their right to keep being educated. And I think about this in all of these movements where, it's often those who are at the like the greatest apex of the harm that are being asked to stand up. And I particularly worry about our youngest students, although I worry about all of us, but I particularly worry about our young students and the psychological burden of that, of having that responsibility, but also like feeling that you are fighting for your family's or your friends' lives. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but like how we as educators, we in the education system can support that as these, it's just an extraordinary burden that we're placing on very, very young people. And I include our college students and very, very young people. So, yeah.
I think plus a million to what you're saying, I don't think any of us, because we're not in school right now, but, I'm sure most of us on this, in this space have had experiences where we've been carrying something into a classroom with us, but I just cannot imagine what these young people today are carrying with them. But I also think we should take a moment and acknowledge the weight that this also places on educators. And at Kent State, there was a professor who was trying to support these young people who was begging the National Guard to stop, and they didn't listen to him. Every day we have educators who are begging their administrations, begging this federal government, begging their states, etc., to protect their the young people that they are supporting. And we also need to stand with them. And, we talk about this all the time, how important our educators are, but we put people in these spaces, and they're often people who, let's just be real, they're underpaid and undervalued. And instead of saying, like, thank you for this great service that you've done, we just continue to make them be the ones who have to stand in front of their students when a mass shooter comes in. And it's just so unfair. And at All for Ed, we really just stand with these young people and these educators.
And I'll chime in here. I think that, we have seen that our strongest movements have been led and fueled by not only the hope that young people bring to the table, but I think equally, or I would argue more importantly, is their courage to resist, right? I think that what we saw here in Tennessee with this most recent fight, we had 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids who were driving 3 to 4 hours to our state capitol to testify in committee in front of these grown people making decisions that are going to impact their lives, right? And begging for their right to an education, right? So I think it's that in these times that felt and feel so dark, they're choosing courage, right? Actively, I say, choosing courage every single day to show up and fight for their freedoms, for their families. And I think that it's important to highlight that for a lot of these folks, young people right now, who their entire life has been, crisis after crisis after crisis, whether it's the pandemic, racial injustices, extreme national disasters, they have been forced into this, right? They have inherited these governments, these societies that have been put in place. And I think this makes me think of the saying of, no one knows best about building power from the ground up than those who have been left out and left aside, right? And I think for so many of these folks, they're living in the society that tells them, here's the different crises that you're going to have to live through, but you're young, so sit back, be quiet, wait your turn, right? And I think that has built up that courage for them to continue to resist, where they feel as if their only power is to dissent, to disrupt, to resist, right? And so yeah, I think in these moments, and I look back at back in 2012, where it was because of folks' own survival to be able to drive to work, drive to school without having to fear deportation, right? Making it back home and hoping that your mom or dad were still going to be there, right? And these youth, these young people were the driving force behind, in 2012, the DACA program, right? That gave folks the opportunity to live and work with this temporary protection, right? And I think that we've seen this throughout history of young people's feeling as if their only avenue is to resist and disrupt, right? They revel in this, and I think that that's also a call to action to a lot of us of showing grace, showing that showing grace to these folks who have built this because of their own survival, the necessity of having to disrupt and to organize themselves and their communities.
No, I
And
think.
I also
Oh,
think
go ahead,
how
Amy.
grateful I am that our young ones have models like Greta, the environmental activist, Malala, kind of the human rights, that we are now beginning to lift up youth activism for a better world in ways that our young people can look to as well. But you're right. Our young people right now have grown up in a world in which this is all they know. And, thank goodness for their courage. But wow, that's a lot to carry. Sorry, Jen, go ahead.
No, that's such an important point, Amy. I was just saying, I think also, understanding the history and knowing what can happen is so valuable. And I think I remember when we were doing some of the research for this episode, there was a story about one of the photographers who got some of the famous shots. He was giving an interview of his eyewitness account, and he was talking about how there were like essentially bullets hitting the ground next to him. And he was asked, like, why didn't you run? And he said, well, I thought they were blanks, because he never could have envisioned that they would have had live fire being fired at the students. And so it's like that, we don't have the frame of reference. I think sometimes we're frozen because we don't know how to act, because no one would have thought that it was possible. And so I think it's important on these days to remember these things, but also to learn from the reality of, like, when we see these things start to happen, we hear this rhetoric, we know where it can end, which does not mean that it must end there. And I think that's also an important message of hope today. Just because it's happened once does not mean it has to happen again, but it does mean we have to be vigilant. And I wonder, talking about educators, such an important point. For our educators out there who are talking to their students today about history, about civic engagement, I guess, what do you say to them? How do they capture this moment for their students? How do they encourage their students to be loud and to be confident in sharing their opinions and not to be scared, or I guess to be courageous through their fear in a really scary environment? We're talking today is a scary thing. And so I guess what thoughts do any of you have for educators who are, I guess, at this moment, hopefully already at work? It's 2 p.m. East Coast time. Yeah, like, what thoughts and ideas do you have for them?
Yeah, if I can put on my educator slash parent lens for this one, I'm the father of three children. My eldest child is 14, and this past election cycle, she became pretty aware of things, to say the least. Even though we try not to talk about those things in the house, we want them to stay as innocent and as young as possible, because, as we said before, unfortunately, this has become so polarized and turning friends against friends and all that kind of stuff. So the biggest thing that I can say is just really providing the opportunity for students to become educated. That's the biggest thing that I can say. As I mentioned earlier, these dark moments in history were kept from me as a student. I didn't know anything about these, and there's so many things. And I love my country. I'm happy. I am an American. I am an American just as much as a person that voted for a different party than I voted for. But it's the whole thing about striving to create a more perfect union. We're not perfect. And so having my child learn about the good, the wonderful things our country has accomplished, and also these horrible things that are in our history as well, so we don't repeat those things, and we can figure out why people were behind that and saying, yeah, that we need to do this, so we can go about ways to ensure that as we become more educated, we don't go down those same roads and make those same mistakes. I think that's where we need to be. We need to be educating and understanding, why did the president feel that this was okay? Why did the governor feel that this was okay? Why did everyday moms and dads feel that it was okay for the government to send the National Guard out there and for lives to be lost? You can watch news reports and people thought it was okay. They were like, oh, it's sad that it happened, but they should have listened. We need to have that conversation, because there are people that feel that way today. There are some people who would be okay if students at Columbia had the National Guard or the police attack them for having a peaceful protest. So we need to have that history lesson so people can understand this and also understand how we can stop this. So I think the biggest piece for me, and I hate to sound like a broken record, is just educating our students around these issues that have happened, so we can have the conversation and put policies in place where these things don't happen again. Because that's the thing that scares me the most as a father, that I have a daughter that wants to be an activist on these issues, that she could be on the front lines, and that could be her that somebody is talking about in 55 years and having her picture up there. And that's not what I want as a father. I don't want my child to be a memory. I don't want her to be one of the kids injured in an incident because she's standing up for her rights. So I think until we think about this as that could be our kids, our grandkids, our nieces, our nephews, we need to put ourselves in those shoes to think about how we can ensure that this does not happen again. I'm getting a little emotional there. I was thinking about that, because when we see these black and white pictures, it makes us think that this is a long time ago. But I just celebrated my birthday yesterday, and this whole thing happened, 9 years before I was born. So it was not that long ago. I don't think I'm that old, but when I see things like this happened 9 years before I was born. It's real.
Adam, what you were saying made me think of the survey that All for Ed did last fall. We did a pre-election survey just before it was election eve, just before the presidential election, and we asked a question about curricula. And I forget how it was phrased, but it was something about do you believe in wanting an honest, truthful, fair curricula that teaches the good and the bad of our history so that we learn from it? And that was resoundingly affirmed across party lines, across all dimensions of identity. We, the people, do want to learn from our history. But then I think about, the history is written by the conquerors, right? Those who won. So how do we think about, telling a full history of events like this in ways that really lift up diverse perspectives and help us learn from it in ways that help us all grow. And your question, Jen, about educators, I think about Rebecca's comment earlier, like no educator came to education because they wanted to be a human shield from a bullet. No educator came to education because they wanted to stand between their students who might be undocumented or from mixed status families and ICE agents coming into their school. Like they came because they love teaching, learning, students, community. And I like my headline to educators is thank you. Like, remember that, you know, the only way to keep going is to keep going, right? Like keep loving on your students, keep loving what you're doing, keep showing up every day, and make connections to community, make connections to students' lived experience, and then also make sure that we learn from what came before us and tell those whole truthful stories about who we are as a nation so that we can become a more perfect union, to quote Adam and our founding fathers and mothers who
I
are
agree. Absolutely. I agree with you. I think so. I was a Montessori teacher, and one of the tenets of Montessori is that you walk into your classroom space, like your environment, as a blank slate. You are joining your, like the children, you are a guide. You are joining them on a journey. And so I think one thing that I would just encourage people to do is, like, you know, we all have opinions, as we know, Rebecca has lots of them. But really just being like joining them on their journey of discovering like where their lines are, what they believe to be right, how they want to interact. Would I have burned down an ROTC building? No, because I'm a rule follower. But I have no judgment for that choice. And I think sometimes we tell young people, especially young people of color, like our BIPOC students, that there are certain ways to show up. And I would like to reject that. And as an educator, I would encourage others to like join me in that and saying, like, you know, obviously, like we want to keep our kids safe. I totally hear you, Adam, on that. But at the end of the day, like they get to make these decisions and we just get to stand behind and or alongside them in those decisions because it is their future.
I also think there's so much we can learn here from the advocacy of our educators who come into classrooms every day and meet their students where they are and advocate for them in this beautiful space they've created. And I'm always very inspired by the advocacy of my siblings who are educators and what they put into this every day. And so I think, and I apologize, I don't remember who made this point, but it was such an important one. I'm going to reiterate it. So just raise your hand. But this idea that like we have to be able to get back to a place where we can see each other as people and actually see the humanity in each other and see these as all of our children. And, you know, I think getting to a place where we can have a disagreement, but ideas, even controversial ideas, aren't met with violence is critical for us to be in this space where we can take on some of these very nuanced ideas. And so I think it's such an important moment. And I think in this moment in our country, in this moment in education policy, in the fights that many of us are part of, such an important commemoration and memorial today to take a moment to reflect on what happened, how we got where we were, and, you know, to the extent that some of these lessons are still echoing through history, there are certain things that have not happened yet. And six families had their babies not come home. And I would like us to not repeat that part of the lesson if we don't have to. And I think there's still time. And so I think we each have a part of that to reflect on how we protect our young people in these very incendiary moments and how we honor their courage that they bring to this, the fire they bring to this, which is so necessary, and how we as adults can do a better job of keeping them safe. I know I will be reflecting on that today. And I wonder if anyone else has any closing thoughts they would like to share as we are getting near the top of the hour.
Thank you for holding this important conversation. This matters.
Thank you all. I think the only thing that I'll very briefly say is, I mean, you know, we are the recipients of generation of folks who decided to refuse sitting back, right? And who always held hope, right? We know the quote of, you know, hope is a discipline and we have to practice it every day, right? And leaving this with that refreshed in memory after this conversation. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I think, for me, I get the privilege of getting to hear about your children, like my colleagues' children. I got to see the children in Tennessee and what they did, and they are so incredible. Like from 2 years old, saving a baby squirrel, to like a 14-year-old who has like a really powerful TikTok, to like an 18-year-old who's going to go change the world. Like these young people that you are raising are incredible, and I'm so like thankful that we get to like share in their experiences and work to like continue to make this world just a little bit better for them.
Yeah, and I'll leave it with what I always tell my daughter: always let your light shine, no matter how dark it is. Light always shine. No matter how bright that light is, you will always see light in darkness. So no matter how much you feel this is the darkness is happening, dark times around, be the light that shines so people can see it and it'll guide them to their desired outcome.
Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. This was an incredible conversation. Thank you, those of you who tuned in to listen today, and just honored to get to continue to do this great work with all of you. Thank you again.